Hey, it's Hammer Time. On this episode of Hammer Time, it's a great privilege to have Senator Jon Kyl with us here today. Senator, I wanted to start, you've long been one of the great champions of our armed forces, and I know that Senator McCain appointed you to a very important Defense Commission that just released a report, and some of the findings were quite jarring. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that report?
Yes, and thank you for the opportunity. One of the items in the defense bill 2 years ago that the Congress passed and the President signed into law was a 12-member commission, and John McCain was the big sponsor of this. He and the ranking Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee each appointed 3 people to the commission, and likewise the chairman and ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee appointed 3. So there were 12 members of the commission. John appointed me as one of those. And the object was to study the national security policy of the Secretary of Defense and then advise him of what we thought about it and advise Congress of what we thought. Well, the first thing we concluded was that the Secretary was absolutely right in contending that we were in a new position now as opposed to 8 years ago when this was really last done. That Russia and China have become competitors of ours in a very active way, and that while North Korea and Iran and terrorism writ large were all threats to the United States, they paled in comparison to the potential threat of a China or a Russia actually engaged in military conflict with us. So the second thing we did was to examine the strategy of dealing with that, and we concluded that the strategy was all right if it were properly resourced. But that was the rub. At the current rate of funding, we could never get there. We're going to have to increase defense spending about 3 to 5% a year above inflation in order to rebuild the military that we have and to create the capacities to, in some cases, even catch up with China and Russia because they've gotten so far ahead in their modernization. And finally, we concluded that if we don't do this, we're not only at risk of enormous casualties and a very costly and long prospect in a conflict, we're at risk of losing a conflict. The United States could lose a war with Russia or China. Now think about the implications of that, especially when you understand that Russia, as part of its military doctrine now, envisions the use of tactical nuclear weapons.
It's terrifying, actually, and to me, the number one objective or responsibility of the federal government is to protect our people. And the question is, it does sound like it's a resource issue, and you know, it occurs to me we have a lot of social spending programs, as worthy as they may be, that are on autopilot, but our defense budget is something that is sort of herky-jerky in terms of how that's funded. And are there any ways to smooth that out so there's certainty in terms of our defense budget?
Well, you just put your finger on the second really important issue. It's not just the top line, which is what I'm talking about, but also the way in which the military is funded. You can't do any kind of long-term planning, especially if you're acquiring new weapons and the like, if you don't know from year to year how much you're going to have to put against those particular programs. The kind of continuing resolutions that fund the military today rather than the regular appropriation process, and also the prospect of sequestration. If we don't meet certain budget requirements, we'll get 5% or 10% shaved across off the top. None of that makes sense if you're really going to fund a long-term acquisition program. And so we said both we need to increase the top line budget for the Defense Department and smooth out that spending, as you say, in the way that Congress actually appropriates the funding.
Because on the business side, we always talk about if there's tax cuts, it's a lot better if they're permanent. So so the businesses can plan for it. If it's 2 or 3 or 4 years, that changes the equation dramatically. And I believe the same sort of principles in play.
We have a lot of defense industries in Arizona, as you know, and they're always talking about adding a couple thousand employees for a particular production line. Let's say that Raytheon in Tucson has got a contract with the government now to buy or to build another 3,000 missiles of some kind. And then they get notice a couple weeks later, well, actually, we don't have the funding for that for the full 2-year program. We've got enough for 6 weeks through a continuing resolution, and then we'll let you know. All right, you're the contractor, the defense contractor. Do you go out and hire those 2,000 or 3,000 people, or do you fire the ones you've already hired? You don't know, and it makes for a very inefficient system.
In some of the areas that are popping up, I know during your distinguished service, during your first 3 terms in the United States Senate, you put a lot of time into cybersecurity, which at the time was pretty novel. Now it's fairly well established. How concerned should we be in terms of what China and Russia are doing in those areas?
One of the commission co-chairmen this morning testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee that we're actually engaged in political warfare right now with China and Russia, among other things because of their cyber attacks against both our civilian sector and our governmental sectors. So this is a real threat right now. And it's not that we don't have the technical capability of dealing with this. And in the case of cybersecurity, it doesn't take that much more in terms of resources, money. What we've lacked there is a coherent government policy and the doctrine to back that policy up. Specifically, for example, we need to have a policy, as we do in other kinds of military conflict, that demonstrates to a would-be aggressor that there will be consequences to the bad action. But we don't have a government policy that allows us to respond to an attack. We don't have a policy that provides deterrence because the American government says to a potential perpetrator, if you do that to us, here's what we're going to do to you. As we do in the case of nuclear weapons, for example. If you launch a nuclear weapon against the United States, you can expect to be obliterated by the United States. That's why we haven't had any nuclear conflict since the end of World War II. But we need that kind of doctrine in cyber, and the lawyers over the last 8 to 10 years have created obstacles to having that kind of policy. The administration is now beginning to change those policies so that our would-be adversaries understand there will be consequences to their actions. And they won't necessarily just be cyber consequences.
Staying a little bit on China, I know China's put a lot of time in their China 2025 plan, and it's not just cyber, it's artificial intelligence, and there's a connection there, not just with economics, but on the military side. Right. How concerned should...
Well, this is one of the areas of the report. China has done 2 things. First of all, they've gone to school on the United States. They've figured out how we conduct our military operations and our doctrine, and they've figured out how to use asymmetric leverage, that is to say, using much less power and putting much less money toward the issue in order to stop the United States. And they've figured out how, through blinding us in space by taking out space satellites, for example, that control everything in our life. I mean, we can't do anything these days without satellites in space, and they know how to take those out. So they could blind us at the very beginning of a conflict where we couldn't communicate with each other. Our weapons wouldn't be precisely guided to their destinations. We couldn't navigate, and in fact, if they do enough of that, it would be very difficult for us to conduct our civilian activities as well. So that's one thing they've done. Second, they put an enormous amount of money into things like artificial intelligence, hypersonics, advanced computing, and other high-tech weapons and technology that we will need to contend with if there's ever a conflict with them in the future. In the past, for example, we've always had air superiority. Ever since the end of World War II, we had air superiority. Now we don't. They've got both aircraft and air defenses that will deny us access to their territory if we ever need to strike it.
Final question. Foremost water expert in the history of Arizona. Senator Kyl, what do we need to do on the state level, and how do we need to work this on the federal level? We seem to be at a very serious point in our state's history when it comes to water policy.
Well, there are a couple of different types of issues that we confront right now. The most immediate is how to deal with the shortages that will be occurring in Lake Mead, are already occurring in Lake Mead. There is a group of the so-called stakeholders, the various agricultural, industrial, city, Native American, and other interests, including the U.S. government, that are trying to work out a plan on how to keep water in Lake Mead so that we don't have to take the level of Lake Mead so low that basically we can't even draw water out of it anymore. We need that water for our future, and it's very hard to do it. If we could get that resolved by the end of the year or very shortly thereafter, we'll have taken a good step forward in ensuring our water future, but there'll be a lot more to do after that as well.
We deeply appreciate your return to service. You're a true statesman. You're a role model for all of us in terms of how to behave. And it's a great privilege to have this chance to sit down with you.
Thanks very much, Glenn. Appreciate it, and appreciate the great job you do with the Chamber.
Thank you, Senator.